it's Lana here from the Schoolhouse for Art. I'm delighted to be back with another Schoolhouse for Art conversation. It's been a while since we're here. We've been busy in the Schoolhouse focusing on lots of really exciting workshops, our regular classes, and this summer we have some fantastic international artists coming to visit. The first of which for this series of workshops based around portraiture and figurative art is Alan McGowan. Alan McGowan is an incredibly expressive figurative artist and teacher. And he's joining us in May and is incredibly generous with his time and joining me today. I'm sorry we're a little bit late. We're having some technical issues, so I'm hoping that we can get Alan. It is a little bit glitchy, but I think we should be able to have a good chat all about tone. Alan. Good to see you again, Alan. How are you?
I think that I seem to be sort of slightly delayed by the technology, so apologies for that.
Not at all.
But I'm very well. But the filming of this seems as though it's a little bit. The connection doesn't seem so fantastic, but hopefully what I'm saying will come across clearly.
Yeah.
So that will be.
Well,
make
great.
up for it.
I can see lots of people are joining us, so we're definitely encouraging questions to come in. We'd love to hear if anyone has a question for Alan this evening. We're just going to have a kind of maybe half an hour discussion all around tone this evening, because I know that's something you're really focusing on at the minute, Alan. I know whenever I look at your work, I'm always captivated by the movement that are in the pieces. Also knowing that your subject is a still model, but there's an incredible expressive approach and loads of movement. I was watching the flow video that you did, the filming you did at the Arts Festival in 2022, and to see the work that you were producing with a live audience, models, music, it was a sensory overload as it was, and still you were able to create this beautiful kind of, would it have been a collage of different model shapes throughout the whole painting?
Well, yeah, the picture itself became, there were about 5 poses, 5 or 6, I think it was 5, and the model moved through these poses, but the poses repeated. So there was a kind of movement, but there was a repetition. So the model returned to the pose that they'd been in after a sort of, you could say there was a cycle of poses, and they went through the cycle. There were different times for that, so it wasn't sort of like always the same length of pose.
Okay.
So they started quite short and then became longer as they went through the cycle. So yes, eventually the painting became a sort of composite, I suppose, of these different poses, but as much as being a picture of the model and the model in the different poses, I think it becomes a picture of an attempt to make a picture, you know.
Okay.
So it's kind of a picture of picture making in a sense, as well as a picture of the model, and I think that's where the appeal for a lot of people lies, because I guess, I mean, a lot of people in the audience would have been artists, so they're kind of interested in the process of making the picture. But I think that it's also, that's kind of why having an audience there made a certain kind of sense, because like if you can see a picture when it's finished, and then it's a picture, but if you see it through the process of being made, then the process becomes kind of a big part of the experience, let's say. So actually, that's what it was. I mean, the whole thing was about an experience. So people came in, and an hour later they went out, and in the middle there had been an experience which involved a model, music, me, and so the outcome of all of that was, in a sense, that there was a picture, but that was only a part of it. The picture was only part of the experience. I
Well,
suppose
yeah,
the
it
focal
certainly
part
had
of
lovely
it.
other aspects of it.
But yeah, that became a very, I suppose that became kind of a literal uh, example of movement in work. But I think that movement's a subject I'm interested in,
Okay.
and I think that there's always movement if we're working with model, let's say. So the model lives. They might be trying to stay still, but they're breathing, they're living, their heart's pulsing. Um, Also, the light, unless we work on just completely under controlled lighting conditions,
Sorry
the light can
to
change.
stop you for a second, Alan. There's a knocking coming in when you're chatting. I don't know if it's from the lead. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that, but there's a kind of a knocking.
Oh, what kind of knocking?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's the microphone cable off the or your headphone cables coming off the microphone. Could that be it?
Oh, right, possibly. I'll try and make sure that
I wonder
that we kind of get them separated. Help. I'll try. There will be a little bit of hammering, which you may hear.
Okay.
There's some jewelers working.
Oh, maybe that's what it is.
A couple of studios away, there are jewelers. So it's artist studios. We have jewellery people and we have all sorts.
Well, it's fine.
There are trades.
It's fine.
So yeah, in terms of movement, so the light may move, but I think that there's a sense that that we move. So the model may be still, but the artist is moving, and the very action of making a picture is it's it is that it's an action. It's not a static thing. It's a creation. So the way in which the thing is made, I think, can be part of what makes it real. It can be part of what makes it an interesting image, but also could be part of what makes it real, because it is a real activity to make a picture. And this is something you can see in, let's say, paintings by Rembrandt or Rubens, especially sketches by Rubens, where it's the movement of the brush through the paint which gives a kind of life to the painting. And that life is, at least partly, it's the life of the subject. Hercules, Rubens, it's Hercules or Diana or whoever it is. So it's partly the movement of the subject, but it is partly the movement of Rubens, and that's what we get when we look at those pictures. Or at least it's what I get when I look at those pictures.
Yeah.
So that's something which I think is valuable.
It was around that time when they started to bring the expressive, wasn't just commissioned work that they were doing. They got to really explore what they could do with art when they could choose their own subjects as well around the time. And
it becomes about an individual vision, I suppose. But also there's a kind of movement in that time in painting into Baroque forms of painting, from the Renaissance into the Baroque, which actually starts to embrace some of the stuff that we are interested in talking about, which is to do with tonality and tonal values. But people start creating pictures more out of light effects, if you like, and using suggestion more in the painting rather than some kind of earlier forms of picture making where things were very defined and sort of stated. So these are two different, these are two different aspects of visual language, and I'm talking about them in terms of the Renaissance and the Baroque, but they don't finish there. They come into modernism, they come into contemporary art. They're always in art, and there's always some relationship between them. But I guess what I'm interested in is kind of pushing that relationship a little bit towards that kind of picture making, which is more about suggestion, it's more about ambiguity, it's more about feeling, um, and it's more about, let's say, light effects and visual effects than about, say, things being tactile or necessarily sort of always stated and articulated very clearly. An example would be, without kind of going off piste on this, but an example would be like, say, Turner's pictures. Earlier on in his career, if Turner's painting like a church or a cathedral or something, very precise, all the windows, all the stonework, very stated. And then later on in his career, then the cathedral was kind of floating in this mist of light and kind of amorphousness, and it's disappearing, and it's kind of weightless, and no, it's still a cathedral.
Yeah.
But at one time, it's more about stating what the thing is, and then later on, it becomes more of a kind of impression, I suppose, a suggestion of the light. So we can be drawing the thing, or we can be drawing the light. And generally speaking, we're doing both. It's not like we're one or the other. We're doing both. But it can be a sort of a slight shift of emphasis. We can move between these poles. And that,
you have always had a career in art. You studied art in Edinburgh. Yeah. You've always just had an interest.
No, yes, I've always had a career in art. It's all I've ever done. I left school, and I actually worked a little bit as an artist before I went to art school, and then after art school, I've always worked in the arts and in teaching as well. Although initially I spent a lot. My initial career was in illustration rather than painting, although my illustrations were painted very often. But it was in that industry that I was working mainly early on, and then I moved, and I was lecturing in illustration, and then about 20 years ago, I kind of transitioned across to be more involved in fine art from illustration.
Because I wonder, when you're talking about, say, Turner and his work kind of ending up more sort of expressive or open for interpretation or emotive, is it as you progress in your art career and your confidence that you can deconstruct a little bit and become a little bit more explorative in what you're doing? Or is it specific approaches that you need to have to then, be a bit more expressive or be a little bit more, pushing things to the boundaries? Because I know with the tone, what we're going to talk about, where you're saying you can become a little bit more, have a little bit more manipulation of it, or bring out the expressiveness of it. Do you think that's with confidence or skill?
I wouldn't find it easy to say whether that's it seems kind of logical, that one might start from a beginning which is a little bit more precise, and then move to something which is a bit looser as you get older. But I'm sure there are lots of examples of artists who start very loose, and there are certainly examples of artists who with a very precise technique who maintain that all the way through their careers.
Yeah.
I think that there's I think it has to do with our kind of innate, just what we like, what we're drawn to. And I think I've always been drawn to kinds of painting which are sort of looser kinds of painting, more expressive, more painterly is the term people often use.
Yeah.
But I think that, the kind of paintwork where the brushwork shows, so we're getting two things. We're not only getting the subject that the picture is all, but we're getting the action of the artist.
Yeah.
And those kind of painters are always the painters that I've liked. I think that what can happen, and probably must happen, is that through years of doing something, you you get to find your own ways of sort of emphasizing the stuff that you want in the pictures. So even in terms of materials or surfaces or what brushes you use, anything like that, over years you move it in the direction you want it to go. So that takes time.
Yeah.
It also takes time to identify the direction you want to go in. So that's not a clear thing. So that can take a while. Um, and then of course there is the just that technical aspect of the understanding, the kind of knowledge,
Yeah.
which you do get better at with practice.
Of
So the
course.
more you do, I think that there are things which are not apparent in my work, but they are there at a sort of deeper level, because they're the foundations for what I do.
Yeah.
And without those foundations, I wouldn't be able to be maybe as loose or spontaneous
Yeah.
as I want to be. But the foundation has to be there to allow you to do that.
Wasn't
People talk
it?
about jazz musicians learn their scales,
Yes.
and then when you see them on stage, that gives them a kind of freedom to improvise and be expressive or loose with what they're
Yeah.
doing. You need understanding to do that.
Wasn't it Picasso who's wasn't it deconstructed a horse, uh, and had just the line drawing, the really simplified line drawing by the end, but he showed where it started was this perfect picture. I'm mixing up maybe the animal, but anyway, he did, and it was the line drawing. So he was saying if I didn't know how to do it well this way, I wouldn't know how to do it from the very, very beginning either. Um,
Yeah, I'm sure there's something to that. That there's a sort of technical expertise that is good to have,
mm-hmm,
that then allows you to have perhaps a different kind of approach, a more spontaneous approach.
mm-hmm,
But I do think it's a mistake to think that therefore learning a very sort of disciplined, precise approach is the first step to becoming a more expressive painter. Because I,
sure.
I think that the and this would be true. We're just talking about jazz musicians
Mm,
there. I've got a friend who's a jazz musician who's working with some classical pianists who are technically amazing pianists, and they can play any kind of piece of classical music, but they find it very difficult to play a 12-bar blues
mm,
because they just that sort of spontaneity and
sure.
improvisation and the kind of groove, the emotional groove of that is not the training that they have. So yes, you need the discipline side of it, but you also, if somebody wants to be a kind of a looser kind of painter, then you have to practice that as well. You know,
Sure.
yeah, that's something that has to be done in order to be developed and explored.
And so we promised we would talk about tone because I know that that has a big focus in the workshop you're doing with us in next month. But and it certainly seems to have a big influence over your work at the moment, and has for many years, I'm sure. But what's your why does tone feature, or how does it feature in your work?
I think that the thing about tone and the reason that I thought this would be a good workshop to teach, um, is that tone is kind of central to everything. So over years, I teach workshops in life drawing, I teach portraiture, I teach various subjects. But whatever I'm teaching, I spend you know about 2/3 of my time I'm talking about tone always, because tone is actually at the heart of everything. Um, and to have kind of tonal control uh, allows us to actually to sort of play around in the picture as well, to make things happen, to manipulate the picture. So there's two sides always, I think. So part of it is about being sensitive to the tonality of the subject. And if we don't have that, then there are problems, you know. So if we're trying to make a picture, trying to make a portrait, say, and we're not being sensitive to some of the tonal relationships in there, then the picture's always going to end up being a bit wonky, and it might be hard to know why the picture is wonky, and that's going to hold us back. So you can end up going round in circles and not taking the picture somewhere you want to take it because it's kind of being undermined all the time. So we want to have that sort of a strong foundation in understanding tonal relationships, being able to read them and being able to be sensitive to them and use that in our work. But the other side of that is that we can use tonality in different ways. So we can use the tone to create certain kinds of atmospheres. You know, tone has a sort of expressive quality, which, and Turner's a good example of this, where you create an atmosphere in a picture, which is as much about that sort of atmosphere as it is about the subject. So we can use tone in these ways to bring a sort of a different kind of language to the work, an emotional quality, which can be important in art, depending on who you are. You know, it's not always for everybody, but actually, that's not true. It is important for everybody, but the emotions are different. You know, it's not like every the Baroque sense of tonality, which tends to be quite low toned, is different from, say, Impressionist sense of tonality, which becomes quite high toned, and they're arguably making different kind of tonal and emotional worlds. But you still have to understand how the tones relate to one another to enable you to do that. There's another aspect to this, which is that I think tone. I think it's something which is not understood and utilized strongly in drawing as much as it could be. I think people tend to think, or at least let's say there's a conventional approach to drawing, which has a sort of an order to it, as it were. So that tends to start with a linear approach, tends to start with outline, tends to start with a certain kind of measuring to try and get a sort of good, in inverted commas, drawing, and then shading or something would come into that. So tonal values would come into that, and maybe after that color would come into that. So there'd be a kind of sequence. You know, there's nothing invalid about that, but there's no law to say that's the way things have to happen either. And I think that we could play around with that, and by bringing in tone at a much earlier stage, even before outline, you can take the picture into different kind of ways, and you use different parts of the drawing process, because line and tone are all parts of the drawing world, and we can create them in different ways. So with different kinds of materials. Also, there's a question here of creating images through shadow, using dark materials, or creating images through light. So we can be using light materials instead. And they arguably have a different kind of impact on how we make the picture and how we think about the picture. So by bringing tone in different ways and at different times, we can expand the idea of drawing. And I'm very much keen on the idea of that sort of expansion. That there's not just one way to do things. This is the correct approach, and it will get you where you want to go. I think that what we want is a range of different possibilities, and then how we try and bring them together involves choices that we make, and the choices that we make start to reflect the kind of person we are, because we're trying to follow our nose here. We're trying to go which way we want to go, and that's a good way of helping people make their pictures reflect them more. They become more individual because you're making choices. If there's only one way to do it, you know, what choices have you got?
Sure.
You either do it right or wrong, I suppose. If you follow if you get the steps right, then you've done it right. If you get them wrong, you've done it wrong. And I don't think that's really true of art or anything. And so I'm kind of interested in this sort of expanding the whole sense of the tonal relationship with things. And that includes the tonal relationship with color. So,
and do you feel that will you be imparting this information for people to discover tone in their own through your methods or how you do it, and then to see if they can apply it to their own work that they can then take further afield back into their own artistic practice?
Yeah, well, one of the things we'll do is to look at various different artists. We'll look at artists, examples of people's work in the workshop anyway. But if we look at how different artists have used tone for different ends, and then think about which of them are kind of more appealing to it, so and these would be incompatible in a sense. One person has taken tone in this direction, another artist has taken tone in another direction, and then we have to decide kind of which way we would like to go, and that can change from picture to picture. But the great thing is that when we understand how to create a sort of tonal world that makes sense, then that can be manipulated without falling apart. It can still hold as a picture, and we can sort of compress it or expand it or play around with it quite a lot. And as I say, we'll look at how different artists have done that. And it very much ties into the use of color, actually. Because if one has a good tonal grounding, then it gives a lot of freedom with color relationships. So whether we want to go into more saturated colors, like sort of Matisse or Fauves or Duran or whatever, or whether we want to have much more desaturated colors, or work with a kind of more of an earth palette, more of a sort of Titian Rubens sort of palette. If we understand the tonal relationships, then that's something that can be done. And we can have choices to say, well, where do I want to take this? If there's a shadow, which is a kind of cool shadow, if it's tonally solid, by which I mean that we've placed it well tonally, then we can afford to really sort of push some of the color relationships quite far, and the picture won't fall apart. And that's something I play around with quite a lot. Using say blues and greens and things in flesh tones. So you would think that would be difficult to work, but if we understand the tonal relationship, actually there's quite a lot of freedom there with color, which again is a kind of expressive possibility.
Is there mistakes? Is there common mistakes that you see a lot with around tone, or things that people would struggle with?
Yeah. I mean there are people. The problem with tone is making a sort of coherent tonal world in the picture, and being sensitive to what's happening tonally. Typically, that means people relating lights to darks in their pictures, and that's what they're concentrating on, but they're not putting in quite so much effort in relating lights to other lights, or relating darks to other darks, or seeing, or indeed thinking in a three-tone way, which I think is a very useful way of drawing. And this is another aspect of tonality. There's quite a lot. There's a lot of aspects of tone. It's great. But another aspect of tone is that if we think of it not just as light and dark, we think of it as a three-tone approach to drawing. It opens up a lot of possibilities and makes drawing. It solves a lot of things in drawing. It makes drawing easier in certain ways that are sort of a different way of thinking about drawing, just in terms of light and dark, doesn't do. And it's also very useful as a way of drawing. So it kind of it bridges into painting very well. So if we bring tonality into drawing very early on, it's a very natural progression into painting. And in fact, we'll do some stuff with paint as well in the workshop. And so I think that for some people, drawing can be one thing and painting another. Whereas on my work, it's almost impossible to. My stuff is both, really, always. It's always both.
Yeah.
And partly that's because I put such emphasis on tonality, that it's just such an easy transition from drawing, sort of sensible transition from drawing into painting. They come together.
When I was preparing for our chat, I saw that you never work from a photograph. Is that true, or you always work?
Yeah.
Do you always work from life?
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Because I imagine with a photograph, your tone is your tone. Within the painting, it's not going to move. But if there's a living person in front of you, there's going to be slight movement, or that you know. Is that a big part of your creations?
And the light can change, and the fact that we're moving, the artist moves, so you're always getting a slightly different aspect on the model. I also think I work a little bit with photography sometimes just through teaching. So we've I've been doing some online teaching, and of course, therefore, you're working with the images which come up on screen and stuff. And something that strikes me through that relationship is that the tonal range in photography is really not as rich as the tonal range of reality. The real world is an amazingly rich tonal environment, and also very challenging.
Yeah.
Photography simplifies it and actually restricts it, so it kind of organizes it. And the tonal range in the photographic image.
We lost you that last little bit. I lost you just that last little bit about photography simplifies it a little bit.
Okay, yeah, so the tonal range in photographs just isn't as rich as the tonal range of the world that we live in. It's also, if you're working from life, it's difficult. The challenges are there. And the challenge, of course, is part of the reason for doing it. I don't want the problems of looking to be solved. Looking is one of the joys of my life. It may be the biggest joy of my life. I don't want it to be sort of, simplified or solved or by some other process.
It's
what we're looking at is difficult.
And so will that be what will you bring that that sort of that joy of looking and how you look and how you see and interpret it onto the paint, onto the surface? Will that be explained while you're here? Do you have kind of ways of identifying what's important?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's largely what we'll be doing for 3 days. We'll be looking. We won't be working with photographs. We'll be looking and trying to make this translation into the image and thinking about how that works and the complexity of it. And obviously I'll be, talking to people, helping them with it. And hopefully people will be, having some problems. Therefore, we can have discussions about that and try and help people with the problem. But also, hopefully, people will just do sort of amazing things as well. It doesn't all have to be about things being bad and being sort of solved. It can be that, it's just it's a wonderful thing to engage in. And as I said, I want to sort of move the emphasis into this area, but that doesn't mean to say that somebody's work then would have to stay in a particular place, because tone doesn't go away. You know, in a year, in 2 years, in 10 years, whatever somebody's working on, tone is still going to be central. So the things that we do will be there at some level, whether they continue in a very tonal way or a less tonal way or whatever. It's part of the actual fundamental vocabulary of making pictures.
Well, I'm delighted that you're bringing this workshop to the Schoolhouse for Art. We're really looking forward to seeing you again over here. You've always ran incredibly successful workshops. Say again?
I think it should be fun.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be loads of fun. We're just figuring out, well, we're just going to try and figure out how to get the lighting spot on for you. So I know I'm going to try and get some time with you when our studio is free, to just show you the setup since you were here last, to make sure that we can kind of, because obviously light and shade will play a big part in the workshop. So we'll talk about that another time. But we've had lots of people joining us this evening. No questions. I think everyone was either had their questions answered, or they will, I know when we post this onto our grid, maybe they can, if any questions come on the aftermath of that, we might send them your way.
Maybe.
But thank you so much for your time.
Maybe they're planning to ask their questions during the workshop. Maybe they're saving their questions for the workshop.
Yeah, all the booking is flying. There's only a few spaces left. I know it's a popular workshop, but I know that there's a few spaces left. But I know if they're not already gone from the people having listened to this chat, I know I'm inspired, and I really look forward to seeing the work that's produced over the weekend. So I know it's Friday the 24th of May until Sunday the 26th, and you can book through our website. Is there anything we didn't get to discuss other than outside of tone or inside of tone? You don't have to tell me anything else.
I don't know. Was there anything?
We might have to have a part 2, because I know going into the tone and color and their relationship is I know you touched on that, but I know it can be a bigger conversation, because then you go into what color is.
I think the only thing that possibly that I didn't say that is valid is that I think that thinking tonally, viewing things tonally, is quite different from the way most people look at the world, and that's something that strikes me in a lot of teaching that I've done over years, that people have a certain way of looking at the world, which tends to be more about what things are, and when they're trying to create their pictures, that's the focus, what something is. Whereas when we look at something tonally, it's not about what it is, it's just about what the light is. So if I'm looking at your image there, I'm looking at Lana and she's asking me a question, etc. But if I'm looking at you tonally, I'm not seeing you at all. I'm just seeing patches of light and shade, some of those and middle tones, and some of those patches of dark relate to these patches of dark. And in my viewing and in our viewing as an artist, you move between those two forms of looking quite rapidly, quite easily. But I think that that's something, naturally people are not really tend to be educated to do that. So they don't see the world in that way. And it can be a little bit of it's just a sort of little bit of a bridge to cross. And then once you cross that bridge, it's amazing.
How exciting. It'll be the adventures of shadow and light and a new way of seeing, because I think it will be giving people this eye-opening opportunity to interpret what's in front of them in a way that will allow them to interpret it onto the surface in a, you know, tonally correct way, but with also a lot of artistic freedom, so that their process and movement and style can come into play as well, which sounds like a great experience.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well,
Okay.
thank you so much. We got here in the end, and I am happy that the technology stayed with us,
Okay, just
stayed on our side.
apologies for my camera, but
No, it's fine. I'm sure we'll enjoy watching it back, and everybody that tunes in after our live will enjoy the conversation. So thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thanks to everyone who've joined the conversation. We look forward to chatting again soon. See you, Alan. Thanks
cheers,
a
Lana.
lot.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.